For months, Officer Kemp thought he could arrest anyone who looked like they didn't belong. He saw Eleanor Brooks, a 62-year-old nurse in scrubs, tired after a night shift, and decided she was guilty. No questions, no verification, just cuffs and cold concrete. But when they picked Eleanor, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she had a brother named Isaiah, a former federal prosecutor, who'd spent decades dismantling abuse from the inside out. What came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one woman. It's about all of us. Sunlight crept across the floor of the precinct that morning, catching on boot scuffs and dust in the air. Phones were already ringing, doors already opening. Somewhere in the distance the first voice rose, not in protest, but in warning. Eleanor Brooks wasn't going to be quiet. And this time, the world was listening. It started with something so ordinary, you might have done it 100 times yourself. Eleanor Brooks, a 62-year-old night shift nurse in Macon, Georgia, pulled into the pharmacy parking lot just after 9 p.m. Her '96 Corolla coughed as she turned off the ignition, headlights dimming beneath a flickering street lamp. The air was thick with southern humidity, the kind that clung to your skin and made even the breeze feel tired. Eleanor moved slowly, carefully, her knees stiff from 12 hours on her feet. Her mind still stuck in the rhythm of heart monitors and quiet prayers, whispered to patients she'd never see again. She just wanted her blood pressure pills, and maybe a moment to feel like a regular woman running a regular errand. That wasn't too much to ask. Inside the pharmacy, things felt off. The teenage cashier barely looked up as she handed him her ID and prescription slip. The boy frowned, then whispered to a pale-faced manager standing by the printer. Eleanor noticed how the woman looked at her, not at the ID, not at the prescription, at her, like she'd tracked mud across a clean floor. Moments stretched thin. The clerk avoided eye contact. The manager approached, voice tight with a forced smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "There's a problem with your prescription. We've already called the authorities to sort it out." Eleanor blinked. "The authorities?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She knew that tone, knew what it meant to be presumed wrong, before a word escaped her lips. Have you ever felt a room change just because you walked into it? She could have left. Maybe she should have. But her bones, weary as they were, still carried pride. Eleanor didn't run. Not from something she didn't do. Not tonight. And as sirens whispered down the dark street and red moonlights danced across the pharmacy glass, something settled heavy in her chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a warning. And Eleanor Brooks knew warnings like these didn't come alone. The two officers arrived like they'd rehearsed it. Boots heavy, shoulders squared, eyes already telling a story that had nothing to do with truth. Eleanor stood still at the counter, her ID and insurance card laid out in front of her like evidence at a trial. She didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. The taller officer stepped forward, Officer Kemp, mid-40s, buzz cut, and a look in his eye that said he'd already decided who she was. His partner, Officer Latham, hung back, younger, unsure, but not enough to stop anything. "She tried to use another person's insurance," the manager hissed, pointing. "Everything's off. I know fraud when I see it." Kemp didn't check the documents. He didn't ask Eleanor a single question. He looked at her like the verdict was already in. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "we're going to need you to come outside with us." Eleanor raised her chin. "Is there a reason you haven't looked at my ID?" Her voice was calm. Too calm, maybe. The kind of calm you learned when panic would only make them more certain you're guilty. The younger officer shifted. The customers in the store had gone quiet. One woman clutched her purse closer. A child peeked around his mother's legs. Somewhere a phone camera blinked red. Kemp's hand moved to his belt. "You can cooperate, or we can escalate. Your choice." Eleanor's breath caught, but she didn't show it. "I've worked 37 years in hospitals," she said. "I've earned this prescription, and my name is Eleanor Brooks." But her name didn't matter. The cuffs snapped tight around her wrists. Have you ever felt your dignity shrink to the size of a zip tie? She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood tall as they walked her out, cameras rolling, strangers staring. The pharmacist said nothing. The manager folded her arms, and behind her, a teenage clerk finally looked up, eyes wide with regret. Outside, the night was hot and silent until the car door slammed shut behind her. And in that quiet, Eleanor realized this wasn't just about tonight. It was about every time her name had been ignored, and her skin had been the only thing that spoke. The back seat of the police cruiser was colder than Eleanor expected, cold like a morgue slab. She sat upright, wrists aching from the handcuffs, the nylon of her scrubs soaked with sweat and indignity. Officer Kemp drove in silence, the radio off, his jaw tight. Officer Latham stared out the window, quiet, but not innocent. People are getting weird with it. They always think they get away with it, Kemp muttered to his partner, not loudly, but loud enough. Eleanor heard every word. She didn't respond. What was there to say that would reach a man who had already decided she didn't belong in her own story? Have you ever felt erased while you were still breathing? The car rolled through sleepy Macon streets, street lamps flickering like nervous eyes. They pulled into the station, a squat, crumbling building with chipped paint and the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. No one greeted them. No one asked questions. Inside, they moved her through intake like a package. Name, race, charge, suspected prescription fraud. The desk sergeant didn't look up when he stamped the form, not until Eleanor spoke. "I've never been arrested," she said. "I'm a nurse. I was picking up my own medication." He barely blinked. That's what they all say. The mugshot flash was blinding. The fingerprint ink felt like tar, but Eleanor stood tall, spine straight, breathing through the humiliation like a woman who had seen worse, because she had. They placed her in a holding cell, bare walls, metal bench, concrete floor. Officer Kemp leaned against the bars, arms crossed. "Still not ready to come clean?" he asked with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor looked him in the eye. "You'll regret this." He laughed. Latham didn't. But something had changed. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of tiredness and fear, something sharp took root. A quiet, burning clarity. This wasn't just cruelty, it was a pattern. And Eleanor Brooks wasn't just another name on their clipboard. She was the wrong woman to disappear. Time moved differently inside a cell. Minutes dragged like hours. Eleanor sat on the cold metal bench, hands resting carefully in her lap, her back never touching the wall. Dignity has its own posture. On the outside, she could hear the hum of a broken vending machine, the shuffle of boots, the occasional burst of laughter, casual, unbothered, as if her freedom wasn't hanging in the balance just down the hall. Then the sound changed. A sudden hush. Not the usual stillness of routine, but something taut and electric. Voices rose, urgent, clipped. A phone rang not once, but twice, each chime louder than it had any right to be. And then, footsteps. Measured, purposeful, familiar. Eleanor's heart skipped once, then settled. The cell door remained shut, but she could feel the temperature in the building shift. And then she heard it. A voice she hadn't heard in years, steady, controlled, laced with steel. "My name is Isaiah Brooks," it said, "and someone is about to explain why my sister is sitting in a jail cell instead of at home, taking the medicine she earned with 37 years of service." Isaiah, her older brother, former federal prosecutor, civil rights watchdog, a man who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. The officers scrambled. Their badges suddenly felt too small. Officer Kemp's smirk evaporated like steam under a hard stare. From inside the cell, Elena smiled. Just barely. Because this time, she wasn't alone. Can you imagine what it feels like when the people who thought they had power realize they don't? She stayed seated as the cell door creaked open. She didn't rush. She stood slowly, adjusted her cuffs, and lifted her chin. They hadn't broken her, not even close. The reckoning had walked through the front door, wearing a tailored suit and carrying her last name. The federal agents arrived before sunrise. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves with sirens or shouting. They simply walked into the Macon precinct with sealed folders, government IDs, and the quiet authority of people who knew every law and every loophole used to avoid it. Isaiah Brooks led them down the hallway, his steps slow and deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but clipped. I have reason to believe this department has violated multiple civil rights statutes, starting with the unlawful detention of Eleanor Brooks. At the front desk, the sergeant looked like he might melt into the linoleum. Officer Latham sat rigid at his post, lips pressed tight. Kemp wasn't in sight. They always disappeared when the lights turned on. Do you know what it feels like to see justice walk in wearing a badge you can trust? Isaiah didn't speak to Eleanor immediately. He let her walk out of the holding cell by herself. No drama, no declarations, just the steady rhythm of a woman reclaiming space. The station was silent, silent the way a church gets when a secret has just been spoken out loud. "I'm here," Isaiah finally said to her, low enough that only she could hear. "And we're not leaving with just your release." They weren't. By mid-morning, the body cam footage was pulled. The officers involved were suspended pending investigation. A federal inquiry launched on the spot. What began as one woman's arrest was unraveling years of buried complaints and misconduct. Kemp, when found, tried to bluster, tried to bark about procedure and suspicions. But it was too late. The footage told the story. No resistance, no raised voice, just Eleanor, calm and clear, asking to be seen. And now the whole country would. Have you ever watched a lie collapse under the weight of the truth? Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stood in the middle of the precinct as the silence deepened and let justice echo off the walls. By noon, the station was no longer theirs. Federal agents lined the walls. Screens flickered with footage. Boxes of internal files, once buried in storage rooms, were opened under fluorescent light. The silence that once ruled the halls was broken by the relentless click of keyboards and the low murmur of investigators gathering truth like storm clouds. Eleanor sat quietly in a small interview room, no longer a suspect, but a witness. A nurse. A woman with a voice they now had to hear. Outside, the crowd had grown. First it was a few bystanders from the pharmacy. Then it became a ripple. Neighbors, church friends, former patients, spreading across Macon like heat from a struck match. Some carried signs, others just carried questions. Why did it take her brother to make them listen? Inside, the officers who once stood with swagger now avoided eye contact. Latham paced in the hallway, chewing a fingernail down to the quick. Kemp, red-faced and sputtering, tried to argue with a DOJ agent, but she didn't even blink. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's the law." And the law, for once, wasn't on their side. Can you picture the moment when someone realizes the system that protected them just ran out of excuses? The footage spoke for itself. Frame by frame, Eleanor's calm refusal to submit. Her soft words, her dignity, the absence of anything resembling a threat. And then, Kemp's rough hand, the cuffs, the sneer. It was undeniable. Zaya watched it, arms folded, jaw clenched, not in anger, but in purpose. He wasn't here to embarrass them. He was here to make sure they couldn't do it again. And as the truth spread through news alerts, social media, whispered phone calls between old neighbors, Macon held its breath. because something had shifted. The doors hadn't just opened for Eleanor. They'd opened for everyone who had ever been told, "You don't belong here." And this time, the city was listening. At first, Eleanor didn't want to speak. She'd done her part, hadn't she? She stood tall. She didn't break. She didn't run. But the press kept calling, and the crowd outside City Hall kept chanting her name. Not in anger, but in gratitude. As if by surviving, she had given them all permission to remember what dignity felt like. Then the letters started coming. A grandmother who'd been searched in front of her church. A high school student stopped 5 times in 1 year for walking home too late. A retired Army vet cuffed in front of his grandchildren because his car looked suspicious. Each one handwritten, each one aching. And Eleanor began to understand. This wasn't just her story. It never had been. So when the local civil rights group asked her to attend a town hall, she said yes. She didn't want a spotlight. She just wanted to listen. But that night something changed. One woman stood and told how her teenage son had been dragged from a gas station for loitering. Another man described being pulled over so often he stopped driving altogether. In silence. All eyes turned to Eleanor sitting near the back. She stood slowly. Not to lead, but because sometimes silence feels heavier than truth. "I was humiliated," she said, "but I was lucky. I had someone powerful come for me. Not everyone does. That's why we're here." And just like that, one voice became many. Have you ever felt a room shift from pain to purpose? By the end of the night, plans were already forming. A class action lawsuit, a coalition, a promise. This ends here. Eleanor didn't feel brave. She felt tired. But she knew tired wasn't a reason to sit down. It was a reason to stand, especially for those still waiting to be heard. 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the courthouse steps, not as a witness this time, but as a woman watching justice find its voice. Inside, the jury had returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Officer Kemp and Officer Latham, once shielded by silence and paperwork, now faced real consequences. Falsifying reports, unlawful arrest, civil rights violations. The courtroom had been still when the foreman spoke. No gasps, no applause. Just breath held too long finally being released. Eleanor? She didn't smile. She didn't cheer. She just stood straight. Have you ever watched something broken begin to heal, one crack at a time? Inside, a sea of faces gathered, young and old, black and white, strangers who now called her by name. Reporters leaned forward, waiting for a quote. She gave them none. She walked to the car, where Isaiah waited beside the door, the same calm expression on his face as the night he came for her. "You did it," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "We did." And they had. The class action suit had opened old closets full of new truths. Cases buried, complaints ignored, promotions given for silence. 6 officers resigned. The police chief stepped down. And for the first time, Macon City Council voted for permanent federal oversight of the police department. It wasn't a revolution, but it was accountability. Later that night, Eleanor sat on her porch, the Georgia dusk humming with cicadas. Her tea had gone cold, but she didn't care. Across the street, 2 kids rode bikes without looking over their shoulders. That, she thought, was worth everything. Do you believe that dignity, once reclaimed, can change more than one life? Because it had, not just for her, but for a city that had finally opened its eyes and didn't look away. Sometimes, the quietest people carry the strongest truth. Eleanor Brooks didn't shout. She didn't fight back with fists or fury. She stood tall, with calm, with clarity, and with the weight of a life lived in service. And that was enough. Her dignity, even when cuffed, was her defense. Her quiet strength lit the spark that brought a system to its knees. The lesson here isn't just about injustice. It's about the power of not backing down when you know you're right. It's about remembering that age, silence, or even exhaustion doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, those who've lived the longest have learned the most powerful way to resist, by standing their ground with grace. So if you've ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or small, remember Eleanor. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You don't have to fight loud to win. You just have to stand with truth in your step and your name spoken with pride. In the end, justice doesn't always come quickly, but when it does, it often starts with someone who simply refused to disappear. In the quiet of her front porch, Eleanor Brooks sat with a cup of tea gone cold, listening to the soft rhythm of cicadas and the laughter of children playing down the street. No crowds, no cameras, just breath, finally coming easy. That was her quiet power, not in what she said but in how she endured, not in headlines but in healing. Justice had made its mark, but the work wasn't over. Her story became part of something larger, an effort to rebuild, to hold power accountable, and to remind a city, a country, that dignity is not negotiable. The names of those who suffered silently for years were finally spoken, and the silence that once protected injustice, it cracked. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.